Before starting this touching story, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any story that moves and makes you reflect. Nicholas Deo was 37 years old when he decided to return to the family mansion. After nearly a decade spent traveling internationally, running million-dollar businesses, and living a routine that blended sophistication with the typical loneliness of someone who builds empires. It was the beginning of spring, and the property, with its silent corridors, solid wood furniture, and heavy curtains that seemed to guard ancient secrets, still carried the weight of generations. Nicholas had grown up there amid formal dinners, strict rules, and a kind of silence broken only by the firm yet welcoming presence of Mabel, the housekeeper who taught him more about affection than any other adult in that house. When he arrived with Isabel, his new wife, the atmosphere was new for some, but a warning sign for others. Isabel had an elegant smile and impeccable posture, the kind that fills a room even before a single word is spoken. She wore a shimmering beige coat and heels that seemed too tall for the mansion's old floor. Her eyes scanned the rooms with an expression feigning admiration, but Nicholas, though distracted, noticed a slight wrinkle of her nose when she saw the floral wallpaper in the living room and the silver candlesticks that her grandmother had so carefully preserved. When Mabel appeared, in her always neat uniform, with her hair firmly tied and that look which mixed discipline with affection, Isabel smiled. But it was a smile too brief, almost automatic, vanishing before it reached her eyes. Mabel immediately sensed that something had changed. It wasn't just the presence of a new woman in the house. After all, Nicholas had already brought other girlfriends to visit the family. But there was something denser, more unsettling in that first encounter. Isabel's gaze, though polite, seemed to assess everything around her as if evaluating an antique piece at an auction, with coldness, without any emotional connection. Still, Mabel maintained her usual demeanor. She offered tea, escorted the couple to the guest room specially prepared for the newlywed, and made sure that everything was impeccable, as it had always been. During that first dinner, with the table set with the silverware inherited from the Deo matriarch and flowers freshly picked from the garden, Isabel remarked between sips of wine that the house had potential, but urgently needed an aesthetic revitalization. Nicholas laughed and dodged the comment, but Mabel felt as if a crack had formed beneath her feet. In the days that followed, Isabel's subtle comments became part of everyday life. She complained about the arrangement of the furniture, about the melancholy light in the main hall, about the smell of the old wax in the cabinets, and whenever she could, she let slip a remark about how everything functioned in an archaic way in that house. Mabel, who knew every inch of that property as if it were her own body, tried to remain professional, but she was beginning to feel a discomfort that was hard to disguise. One morning, while adjusting the cushions in the living room, she heard Isabel talking on the phone in the garden, saying in a mocking tone that it felt like going back in time, like a setting from a period drama. That wasn't just a comment about decoration. It was a disregard for the history of the house, for the family's memory, for everything Mabel had so carefully preserved over decades. And more than that, it was an indirect way of disqualifying the very role she played there. Nicholas, for his part, tried to balance everything with a diplomacy that only accentuated the overall discomfort. Whenever Isabel made a biting remark, he pretended not to notice, or responded with a neutral comment, as if ignoring it could dissolve the growing tension around them. He told himself that Isabel was just trying to adapt, that initial strangeness was natural, and that over time she would learn to value the house and its traditions. But inside, he was beginning to feel uneasy. Mabel noticed those silences, those pauses he took before responding, those glances that avoided meeting hers. It was as if he had become a hostage of his own choice, incapable of confronting the truth about the woman he had married. And while he postponed that confrontation, the small offenses continued, always subtle, always disguised as good intentions, but increasingly cutting. One afternoon, Isabel appeared in the kitchen with a glass of red wine in hand and an expression of boredom on her face. She said in an almost childish tone that she had accidentally spilled the drink on the tea room's tablecloth. She asked Mabel to clean it as soon as possible before it stained any further. When Mabel arrived in the room, she found not only the stained tablecloth but also her own uniform splattered with wine. The glass lay discarded, with a splash still trickling from the edge of the table. It was evident that this had not been an accident, and Isabel didn't even bother to hide her ironic smile when their eyes met. Proudly, Mabel silently gathered everything up, with a dignity that contrasted with the vulgarity disguised as elegance that was beginning to take over the house. And yet, that night, Nicholas did not utter a single word about the incident. Nicholas's lack of stance was beginning to silently corrode something within Mabel. It wasn't just about enduring humiliations. It was about realizing that the boy she had helped raise, the one who used to cry in her arms after nightmares and smile when he got her gingerbread cookies, was now watching his dignity being dismantled in silence, as if it didn't matter. The house, once a symbol of care and history, seemed to shrink in the face of that new presence that occupied everything with its polished arrogance. Gradually, Mabel began to avoid certain rooms, to speak less than she once did, to restrain gestures that had once been part of her daily rhythm. It was as if she were ceasing to exist there, even though she remained present. Even the other employees, who had always treated her with admiration, now approached her less, not out of disdain, but out of fear of also becoming Isabel's target. The tension became noticeable even to the most distracted visitors. At a Sunday lunch, Aunt Moran, a short woman always wearing exaggerated necklaces and with a voice that seemed to echo through the walls, watched Isabel throughout the meal with narrowed eyes. She noticed how Isabel interrupted Mabel in mid-sentence, how she laughed too loudly when someone praised the old decoration of the house, how she made a point of saying that everything needed to be urgently revamped. At the end of lunch, Marin pulled Nicholas aside on the porch and said in the frank manner only she knew, "This woman doesn't like your history, my son, and anyone who doesn't respect your roots will one day tear your very foundation out." Nicholas laughed and dodged the comment, as he always did. But that night, as he lay beside Isabel, it took him longer than usual to fall asleep. There was something in his aunt's words that continued to echo inside him. In the days that followed, Isabel's gestures became even more blatant. She began giving orders directly to the house staff, overriding Mabel as if she were merely a decorative figure. She rearranged the entrance decor without warning, replaced the old cutlery with modern, shiny models, and even suggested that the old portrait of the Deo matriarch hanging in the main hall be taken down because it weighed down the atmosphere. Mabel listened silently, but the tightness in her chest was constant. She felt as if she were witnessing the silent dismantling of a place that had, for years, been an extension of her own identity. It wasn't just a house. It was part of her history. It was where her memories hung on the curtains, in the scents, in the silent routines of the corridors. And now, all of that seemed to be erased in the name of a modernity that arrived in high heels and a false smile. James, Nicholas's younger brother, was the next to notice the discomfort. Unlike his brother, James was more impulsive, direct, and had never been one to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. On a quick visit to deliver some company documents, he noticed Mabel acting strangely withdrawn. She, who always greeted him with a strong coffee and a light conversation about childhood times, now barely looked him in the eyes. When he asked if everything was all right, she simply smiled and replied with a "Everything is in order, Mr. James," which sounded too stiff coming from her. James left with a nagging suspicion. On the way back, he called Nicholas and got straight to the point. "Mabel is different, and that woman of yours, be careful. She carries herself as if everything were hers, but what she really wants is for no one else to feel part of anything. Nicholas responded with a long sigh, but again evaded the confrontation. What hurt Mabel most wasn't Isabel's disdain. She could identify, recognize, and even endure that with a certain coldness. What truly pained her was Nicholas's silence. The boy who once called her in the middle of the night because he dreamt of monsters had now become a man who watched impassively as true monstrosity took shape right before his eyes. One night, after climbing the stairs following yet another venomous comment by Isabel in front of the staff, Mabel stopped in the corridor, leaned against the wall, and felt a knot in her stomach. She looked at the portrait of young Nicholas still hanging next to the old Venetian mirror and felt a deep desire to vanish. It was as if that boy, with eyes full of innocence and a somewhat crooked smile, had died at some point in his journey, and she had been left behind, alone, guarding the memories of a time no one else seemed to respect. The breaking point came on a cloudy morning, one of those when the sky seems to weigh on the roof of the house. Isabel entered the kitchen with an air of boredom, saying that she would be receiving some friends for brunch, and that everything needed to be presentable and less outdated than usual. She ordered Mabel to change the dishes, to arrange the flowers with less of a cemetery look, and to prepare a selection of appetizers less provincial. During the preparations, she pretended to stumble and knocked over a tray of freshly baked tarts. The pieces scattered across the floor, and before Mabel could even bend down, Isabel exclaimed loudly in front of two staff members, "Oh, Mabel, always so inattentive. That's why things are always out of place in this house." It was cruel, it was calculated, and it was the first time Mabel felt tears burning her eyes, unable to hold them back right there in the middle of the kitchen. Nicholas was not present when the incident occurred, but he learned of it through Isabel, who, with an air of feigned innocence, recounted the episode as if it had been merely a small setback caused by the lack of attention from the team. He listened, made a brief comment about revising the house's menu, and continued his day as if nothing had happened. But that same afternoon, when he passed Mabel in the corridor, he noticed something different about her. Her steps were slower, her eyes lower, and her usually calm demeanor seemed burdened by a weight he couldn't name. He tried to start a conversation, to ask if everything was all right, but Mabel only nodded and kept walking without stopping, without smiling. That unsettled him. For the first time, Nicholas felt a real pang of discomfort, a restlessness he could no longer easily ignore. That night, while walking through the gardens after a work video conference, Nicholas stopped in front of the old cast-iron bench where he used to sit with Mabel when he was a child. He remembered an afternoon when he had cried because he was humiliated by a teacher, and Mabel, in her low and firm voice, told him, "Never lower your head to those who try to belittle you, but also never be silent in the face of what is right." The memory hit him like a punch, and then he realized he had done exactly the opposite. He had remained silent when he should have spoken. He had bowed his head when he should have stood up, and in that process he was losing not only Mabel's trust, but his own identity, because deep down he knew protecting Isabel was easy. The hard part was facing the mirror and admitting that he had failed to protect those who truly mattered. In the days that followed, Mabel began to discreetly distance herself from some tasks. She let other employees take command of the kitchen, asked that the arrangements be done by younger hands, and avoided as much as possible staying in the same spaces as Isabel. The brightness of her presence, the one that filled the corridors quietly, was fading, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. What had once been a home now seemed like hostile territory, and with each subtle gesture from Isabel, Mabel felt as if she were being pushed out the door. Even the few moments of respite, like her morning walks through the garden, were avoided, since Isabel had ordered the pruning of some of Mabel's favorite rose bushes, claiming they interfered with the view from the porch. It was as if there were a silent plan to erase all of Mabel's marks from that house. On one particularly cold morning, Mabel made a decision. She calmly put on her uniform as she did every day, but this time with a different tightness in her chest. She walked to the office where Nicholas usually worked and asked to speak with him. When she entered, he immediately stood up, surprised. There was something in her gaze that he hadn't seen in years, a deep yet serene tiredness, as if she had decided to leave long before announcing her departure. "I came to say goodbye, Mr. Nicholas," she said, with a firm yet choked voice. He tried to understand, tried to argue, but Mabel was clear. "This house is no longer mine, and it's not because of what they did to me. It's because of what you failed to do." With that, she handed over her keys, thanked him with a contained smile, and left, leaving. Nicholas, standing in the middle of the room, heartbroken and feeling that something essential had just been lost forever. If this story touches you in any way, leave your like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and comment below on what you are feeling. Your participation makes all the difference. The silence that settled in the mansion after Mabel's departure was unlike any other experience there before. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a house asleep at dusk, nor the respectful silence of an old home. It was a heavy, uncomfortable, almost deafening void. Her absence was felt in the small details, in the aroma of coffee that no longer had the same flavor, in the way the sheets were folded without the same care, in the absent touch of the hands that discreetly adjusted crooked pictures in the corridors. Nicholas tried to continue his routine, but everything seemed off. Even Isabel, apparently indifferent, noticed the change in the atmosphere. The employees were colder, the tasks less organized, and no matter how hard she tried to command everything with her arrogant posture, nothing worked with the same harmony as before. Mabel was not just a housekeeper. She was the invisible thread that stitched every piece of that house together. It was in this strange atmosphere that Aunt Maren returned to visit the house. As soon as she crossed the door, she noticed the different air. She walked silently through the rooms, observing every detail with attentive eyes. She found Nicholas in the garden, dejected, holding a cup of tea that had already grown cold. She sat next to him without saying a word for a few minutes, simply watching her nephew with a look that mixed affection and exasperation. "So, Mabel is gone," she said bluntly. Nicholas only nodded. "And you left her," she added. It was a short but cutting conversation. Maren wasn't there to comfort him. She was there to make him face the truth. You know what she represented, and you also know that losing people like that is not like losing an object. You can't replace them. You can only mourn or try to fix things if there is still time. Nicholas fell silent, but inside, that last sentence ignited something he still couldn't name. That night, Nicholas couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, stared at the ceiling for hours, tried to distract himself with anything, but everything in him screamed the absence of Mabel. He remembered when, as a child, the house seemed a safe refuge, where he ran through the corridors and always ended up finding Mabel with a discreet smile, ready to calm him. Now that home seemed like another place, cold and impersonal, like a soulless luxury hotel. Isabel, on the other hand, slept peacefully beside him, oblivious to the emotional chaos that had taken over him. For the first time, Nicholas began to wonder if he really knew the woman he had married. Her actions, which he used to dismiss as personality clashes, now seemed deliberate, calculated, almost perverse, and perhaps worse than that, he began to see his own silence as complicity. The next day, something in him broke. He woke up earlier, had breakfast alone on the porch, and sat watching the garden in silence. It wasn't just missing Mabel. It was regret. It was shame. It was the heavy burden of knowing he could have done something but didn't. When Isabel came down for breakfast with her usual haughty posture, she commented disdainfully that the new employee had forgotten to change the cutlery. Nicholas, without lifting his eyes from his plate, replied coldly, "Funny. This never happened with Mabel." Isabel let out a short laugh, but noticed his tone. Throughout the day, Nicholas remained silent, But he was no longer the same. He no longer tried to soften her remarks. He no longer laughed at her ironies. And by the end of the afternoon, he sought out his brother James, ready to talk. "I let Mabel go out of cowardice, James, and it is eating me up inside. I don't know if I can look in the mirror and respect the man I've become." James listened in silence, with that restrained manner he always had in serious conversations. After a few minutes, he said only, "Then do something about it. Go after her. If you don't fix this now, you'll spend the rest of your life trying to fill this void with anything else, and you won't succeed." Those words hammered in Nicholas's mind for the rest of the day. He knew that apologizing wouldn't erase everything that had happened, but he also knew that remaining silent would condemn him to permanent regret. The next day, early in the morning, he got into his car without telling anyone and hit the road toward the small village where Mabel had lived since she had distanced herself from the city. He carried in the passenger seat an envelope with documents that she had left at the house, but the truth was that it was only an excuse. The real thing he carried was the hope of being heard. He arrived at the simple house with a beige facade and a small garden at the entrance where modest flowers grew disorderly, like everything that flourishes without pretense. He knocked on the door with a heavy heart, more nervous than in any business meeting. When Mabel opened, she took a second to react. She was wearing her apron, her hands still full of flour, and a slight trace of surprise on her face. Nicholas felt the knot in his throat tighten. I came to bring this," he said, handing over the envelope. She took the package calmly, but kept her gaze fixed on him. "That's it?" she asked without irony, just with the same firmness as always. "No," he replied, averting his eyes. "I came to ask for your forgiveness, Mabel. Not just for what Isabel did, but mainly for everything I allowed to happen. I was weak, and now I'm trying to find a way to fix it, if there is any left." Mabel was silent for a few moments, holding the envelope as if it weighed more than it should. She watched Nicholas with a look that mixed hurt and clarity. There was no anger, but there was no rush to forgive either. "Do you know what hurt me the most, Nicholas?" she finally said. "It wasn't her words, nor her actions. I've faced worse people in my life. What broke me was seeing you remain silent. It was realizing that in the face of everything you chose the comfort of apparent peace over the truth. And that, my son, that hurts more than any humiliation." Nicholas felt his face warm, swallowed hard, and nodded. He knew. He knew of every silence, every time he pretended not to see, every attempt to normalize the absurd just to avoid confrontation. And now, there before her, he felt small, but for the first time, genuinely willing to listen to everything that needed to be said. "I didn't come here expecting you to come back," he continued in a low, almost broken voice. "I just needed to look into your eyes and say that you didn't deserve to go through that you were always a part of my life, my history, my family, much more than anyone else trying to occupy that place with arrogance and vanity." Mabel sighed deeply, placed the envelope on the living room table, and pulled up a chair. She sat calmly and, after a few seconds, pointed to the chair next to her. "Sit, Nicholas. If we're going to fix something, we start with conversation." And it was in that simple yet immensely symbolic gesture that he understood that perhaps there was still room to rebuild what had broken, not with promises, but with presence, humility, and respect. The conversation lasted for hours, but time seemed to slow within that simple house. Nicholas spoke as he hadn't in a long time, without pretense, without calculated speeches, without the social masks he had worn since learning to be Mr. Deo. He recounted how lost he had been feeling, how he had realized too late the damage he had allowed to grow within his own home, and how everything in his life felt less solid after Mabel was gone. Mabel listened intently. Sometimes she made a brief comment. Sometimes she just nodded, but never interrupted him. She didn't need to say much. Her presence was already a sufficient answer. At the end of the conversation, Nicholas slowly got up, with a different kind of tiredness on his shoulders, as if he had finally laid down an old burden. Before leaving, he turned to her once more. "If one day you decide to come back, know that the house is yours. And if you don't want to, I'll understand. But in any case, thank you for receiving me. Thank you for not closing the door." Mabel stood up, walked to the door with him, and before he reached the gate, she said something that made him stop instantly. "The house was never what it was without the right people in it. Think about that." Nicholas nodded, and in that moment he knew that those words weren't just about her, they were about him as well. He returned to the city in silence, with a lighter heart, but a mind churning with everything that still needed to be done. It wasn't enough to have listened, he had to act, reverse whatever was still possible, and prove through actions that he had learned. And deep down he knew true repair would begin not when Mabel returned, but when the house became worthy of her again. In the following days, Nicholas began to change. Small actions that once seemed unthinkable became part of his routine. He gathered the staff for an honest conversation, listened to their complaints, acknowledged his shortcomings, and apologized for his absence. He ordered the restoration of the old arrangements that Isabel had replaced and returned the family portraits to their original places. He cancelled the renovations that had begun without consultation and requested that the house's atmosphere reflect its origins again, not the cold, impersonal aesthetic that had taken over. Gradually, the mansion began to find its tone once more. With each gesture, Nicholas felt he was reconnecting with something he had left behind, not only with the house, but with who he was before getting lost in appearances and silences. The break with Isabel was inevitable. She noticed the changes and, with her habitual irony, tried to disqualify them, saying that he was regressing and that all of it was useless emotional attachment. But Nicholas no longer reacted the same way. Instead of dodging or trying to balance the speeches, he spoke firmly. "What you call attachment, I call roots, and I'm tired of pretending that it doesn't matter." The discussion was short but definitive. Within a few days, Isabel packed her things and left with the same coldness with which she had arrived. There was no warm farewell, no dramatic scene, just the silent closing of a chapter that for Nicholas had been a deviation from the path, a shortcut that had taken him away from everything that truly mattered. And for the first time, as he closed the door behind her, he felt that he was losing nothing. He felt, yes, that something had been regained, as if part of the house and of himself had begun to breathe again. A few days after Isabel's departure, Nicholas found himself walking alone through the corridors of the house, as if rediscovering every room. He ran his hands along the walls, observed the details of the woodwork, sat on the old sofas, and mentally relived moments from his childhood. The house seemed to breathe differently, lighter, almost grateful. And it was in that silent process of reconnection that he decided to write a letter to Mabel. Not a formal letter or one filled with ornate words, but a simple, sincere letter, as if he were talking to her around the kitchen table, like in the old days. He spoke about everything that had changed, about every step he was taking to rebuild that home, and most of all, about how much he missed her, not just for the role she played, but for the emotional space she occupied in his life. 2 days later, the reply arrived. It was a small envelope without a sender, with a firm and elegant handwriting that Nicholas immediately recognized. There was only one sentence written, short but with enormous weight. "A home is not built alone, I'm thinking." There was no promise of return, nor a definitive refusal. It was a sign, and that was enough to rekindle in him the hope that perhaps there was still a chance for a true restart. From that day on, he intensified his care for the house, not out of obligation, but because he wanted that. If Mabel ever decided to return, she would find the place as dignified as she had always kept it. He rehired former employees, reopened the library that Isabel had locked away, and gradually began to rescue the small rituals that kept the heart of the house beating. More than a physical renovation, Nicholas was undertaking an emotional reconstruction, brick by brick, gesture by gesture, memory by memory. Over the weeks, the house began to regain a rhythm that felt more authentic, more human. The sounds of footsteps, discreet conversations in the corridors, and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen started filling the space with a silent warmth that had long been missing. Nicholas, now more present, made it a point to follow everything. He asked about the details of the day, listened to the staff's suggestions, and participated in decisions that he used to leave to others. Gradually, the bonds were strengthening again, not out of hierarchical obligation, but out of mutual respect. It was evident to everyone that the boss had changed. He was no longer the distant man, concerned only with business and appearances, but someone relearning how to connect with what truly mattered. Then, on a sunny Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Nicholas was on the porch reading the day's newspaper when one of the staff informed him that someone was at the door. As he approached, he saw Mabel standing there, with her hands folded over her bag and the same firm look as always. There were no smiles or theatrical gestures, only presence. Nicholas took a second to process, as if that moment were unreal. "Good morning, Mr. Nicholas," she said calmly. "I received your letter, and I came to see with my own eyes if what you said was true." He made room without saying a word, and she entered slowly, observing every detail, every corner, every familiar scent. She walked through the corridors at a leisurely pace, feeling the floor creak under her feet, the gentle perfume of freshly arranged flowers, the shine of the carefully polished furniture. And for the first time since she had left, Mabel felt that the house, finally, was once again what it had once been, a true home. Nicholas accompanied Mabel in silence, unhurried, respecting her pace in every room. When they reached the main hall, she slowly approached the portrait of the Deo matriarch and stood for a few seconds simply looking at it. "Good thing it's in the right place," she said, almost in a whisper. He nodded without interrupting. Mabel then looked around, examined the details, touched the edge of the sofa with her fingers, and let out a soft sigh. It was as if she were evaluating not only the house, but also Nicholas's intentions. He knew that, and so he didn't try to convince her with grand words. He preferred that she see in his gestures what he still couldn't fully express. When they sat down for coffee, prepared with the same care as always, Mabel noticed that even the old blue porcelain cup had returned. To the tray, small things that to her said everything. The conversation was lighter this time. They talked about the garden, about changes among the house staff, about plans to keep the library open for community cultural gatherings, a long-held idea of Mabel's that had never before materialized. Nicholas mentioned that everything was already being arranged and that it would be an honor if she wanted to help coordinate the project. She smiled for the first time that day, a contained but genuine smile. "We'll see," she replied. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. When the coffee ended, she got up and said she needed to leave, but before going, she looked at him with an expression mixing nostalgia and care. "The house is different, but the most important thing is that you are different. That indeed changes everything." Nicholas walked her to the gate, and as he watched her depart, he felt that a bridge was finally being rebuilt between the past and the present. In the following days, Nicholas continued his routine with a different feeling in his chest, not one of relief, but of purpose. He was no longer driven by guilt or remorse, but by a genuine desire to make that place a space where people wanted to be. The small transformations continued. Some of the older employees returned seeking work there, drawn by the news that the house had returned to how it used to be. The atmosphere became increasingly welcoming, closer to what Mabel had cultivated for so many years. Still, Nicholas knew that his part in the reconstruction wasn't limited to aesthetics or household routines. It was about presence, listening, and posture, and above all, about never again allowing silence to be his response in the face of injustice. One afternoon, while rummaging through some old boxes in the attic, he found a small leather diary, tarnished by time. It belonged to Mabel. Simple notes, recipes, reminders, staff birthdays, names of local suppliers with affectionate remarks beside them. There was something deeply human on those pages, a kind of care that couldn't be taught in courses or found in resumes. It was quiet, everyday dedication, invisible to those who only valued results. Nicholas spent hours reading every page, moved by details he had never known she took care of. That reinforced even more in his mind that Mabel wasn't just part of the house. She was its structure, its foundation, and more than that, she was an example, a model of quiet strength, silent dignity, which he would now carry with him not as a debt, but as a guide. Closing the diary and carefully storing it, Nicholas felt that he'd received a legacy that no will could ever record. A living legacy, woven in silence, but destined to echo forever. A few days later, Mabel appeared again. She didn't announce it, didn't send a message. She simply arrived, as if she knew she didn't need permission to enter where she always belonged. Nicholas received her at the entrance with a timid smile, still a bit uncertain, as if he feared spoiling any gesture with excess. "I came to see how things are here," she said, removing her sunglasses with the calmness of someone who never stopped being part of that place. She walked to the kitchen, observed the utensils in their usual spots, smelled the aroma of freshly baked bread, and smiled at the newest employee, who looked at her with reverence. Mabel didn't need introductions. Her presence was recognized in the air, on the walls, in the eyes of those who knew her story. It was as if, finally, the house breathed with more fullness. Her visit lasted longer than she had planned. Nicholas invited her to lunch and prepared with his own hands one of the recipes she had taught him when he was a teenager. Mabel watched every movement with curiosity, surprise, and a hint of discreet pride. When he set the table, she smiled subtly and commented, "I never thought that one day you would cook." "Neither did I," he replied, laughing. The lunch was light, almost symbolic, as if every bite reaffirmed that something had transformed there. And after the meal, while walking together in the garden, Nicholas asked, in the most respectful tone he had ever used with anyone, "Have you thought about what we discussed that day, about coming back?" Mabel paused for a second, looked at the rose bushes, now blooming again, and answered without haste, "Coming back, maybe not. But staying, who knows? Let's see if this house still deserves my presence." And she continued walking, with the serenity of someone who knows her own worth. After that day, Mabel began to frequent the mansion more often. She never explicitly said that she had returned, but her presence once again became a part of the routine, almost naturally. She arrived early, had coffee in the kitchen, exchanged conversations with the staff, and offered subtle suggestions here and there, always in that firm yet discreet manner. Nicholas respected every step. He never pressured, never demanded. He knew that rebuilding trust wasn't done with formal invitations, but with consistency, and that was what he offered, consistency. With every gesture, he showed that he was willing to learn from his own mistakes, to truly value what he once took for granted. And gradually, Mabel too lowered her defenses, allowing that new Nicholas to approach, not as a boss, but as someone who had finally understood the meaning of respect. Over time, the house began to beat again as it once had, but with a subtle difference. Now there was truth in the bonds. Lunches regained their place as moments of gathering. The meetings among the staff ceased being mere formalities and became genuine listening sessions. The library began to receive community children, the garden blossomed without artificial intervention, and the corridors once again echoed with voices, footsteps, and stories. One day, Mabel arrived with a new, hand-embroidered apron and hung it on the hook in the kitchen, a simple gesture that spoke more than any announcement. She had decided to stay. Nicholas saw that gesture from afar and said nothing, only smiled. He understood that this time there was no need to ask or thank aloud. It was a new phase, built with maturity, repair, and affection. and above all with the certainty that certain people are irreplaceable, no matter how much time tries to convince otherwise. A few weeks later, during a quiet conversation at the end of the afternoon, Nicholas and Mabel sat, again on the old cast-iron bench in the garden, the same bench where they had often talked during his childhood. The sun set slowly, tinting the sky with orange hues, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but comforting. "Do you remember when I used to say that this house was only alive because it had real people in it?" Mabel remarked, looking toward the horizon. Nicholas nodded with a contained smile. "Today, I understand what you meant. I truly understand, and I swear I will never forget." Mabel watched him for a few seconds, as if assessing that silent promise. She didn't reply immediately. She simply rested her hand on his with a gentle squeeze that said more than words. It was the kind of gesture that carried reconciliation, but also restored trust. From that moment on, something consolidated between them. It wasn't just a resumption of what existed before, but a new relationship built on more solid, mature, and conscious foundations. Nicholas began to ask Mabel for advice on important decisions about the house, and even on personal matters he had once kept to himself. She, in turn, resumed part of the home's organization, but now with more autonomy, choosing what she wanted to do and when she wanted to do it. And no one questioned it. Her presence was respected as if it were part of the structure, not because of hierarchy, but because of genuine recognition. The curious thing was that even with all this, Mabel never lost her simplicity. She continued having the same strong coffee, wearing her worn-out shoes, writing her reminders on old paper. But now, every detail was valued by everyone, because everyone knew it was in her simplicity that lay the greatness which had long been invisible. As time went by, the effects of that transformation began to spread beyond the mansion's walls. People from the community started commenting on how the atmosphere in the house had changed. Former employees who had left demotivated returned to visit, many simply to see Mabel, share a hug, have a coffee. The library, now open weekly for guided visits, began receiving praise even from the local government. Nicholas, who had previously avoided getting involved with what he considered small matters, now attended meetings, suggested improvements, and listened carefully to the demands. It was noticeable how his attitude had changed. But the most impressive thing was that none of it seemed forced. He didn't do it to appear as a good man. He did it because he had finally understood the value of caring, of repairing, of respecting. It was a new cycle, and everyone perceived that he had entered it with a clean heart. On a Sunday morning, while watering the plants next to Mabel, Nicholas remarked almost jokingly, "If my father saw all this, I'm not sure whether he'd slap me or hug me." Mabel laughed, but soon replied with the seriousness that sometimes suddenly marked her words. "Your father had a limited vision of many things, but he would have learned, too, if he had had the courage to look within like you did." Nicholas fell silent, reflecting on those words. Deep down, he knew that the journey he had experienced was more than just a change of environment. It was a change of identity. And there, in the middle of an ordinary morning, with his hands dirty from the soil and the sound of birds in the background, he felt a genuine peace he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the confirmation that, at last, he had rediscovered his essence. Months passed, and the house no longer carried the remnants of the coldness Isabel had left behind. The air felt lighter, the spaces more alive, and even the old furniture seemed to shine with a different energy. Nicholas began to make small notes in a personal notebook inspired by Mabel's old diary. He wrote down thoughts, ideas, random phrases that emerged during the day. It was his way of not disconnecting from everything he had learned during that process. Once he wrote, "The house healed when I learned to listen to the one who was always here, and when I stopped protecting what never protected me." He showed that phrase to Mabel, who only smiled and said, "You're learning." It was a discreet compliment, but coming from her, it carried immense weight. During a dinner with a few guests, Nicholas decided to do something he had never done before. He publicly thanked Mabel, not with rehearsed speeches, but with honest words. He stood up, holding his wine glass, and said, "Much of what this house is today is due to someone who was always here, even when not heard. I thank Mabel not only for what she did, but for what she represents: dignity, consistency, and truth." There was a brief silence, followed by discreet applause. Mabel, visibly moved, simply nodded and lowered her eyes. She had never sought recognition, never demanded anything. But in that moment, she felt that everything she had experienced, including the pain, had gained meaning. It wasn't about status or function. It was about respect, the kind that is not asked for but earned. And there, among simple dishes and sincere gestures, the story of the house was being rewritten with more truth than any renovation could ever offer. In the following months, that dinner became a symbolic milestone. Nicholas's words resonated among the staff, relatives, and even some of the old family friends who rarely appeared. Everyone began to look at Mabel with even greater reverence, not out of formality, but genuine recognition. She, for her part, maintained her unshakable essence. She continued arriving early, taking care of the details with the same patience as always, sitting in the garden during her spare moments with a book in her lap and a cup of tea by her side. But there was something different about her now, a calm sparkle in her eyes, a lighter demeanor, as if, after everything, she had rediscovered not only her place in the house, but also the certainty that her presence there was a choice, not a favor, and that made all the difference. Nicholas, now with a different outlook on life, began to have deeper conversations with Mabel, not about routines or tasks, but about feelings, the past, choices. Once, he confessed how ashamed he felt for taking so long to notice everything that was wrong. Mabel, with the serenity of someone who had seen many lives break and rebuild, replied, "We only see what we're ready to see. Sometimes life has to shake everything up so we understand where we are truly stepping." That phrase lingered in Nicholas's mind for days. He knew that his maturation process hadn't been linear or quick, but it had been genuine. And today, looking back, he recognized clearly. It all began on the day Mabel decided to leave. It was in that silent rupture that he was forced to look at himself, at the void he had allowed to settle. And it was precisely that void that made room for what truly needed to bloom. In a quiet late afternoon, Nicholas decided to do something symbolic. He took one of the old keys of the house, the heavy ones with intricately worked metal details, and had a small inscription engraved on it: "For those who never let this house lose its soul." He handed the key to Mabel without fanfare, simply extending his hand with the key resting in his palm. She looked at the object, then at him, and immediately understood its meaning. It wasn't a gift, it was a definitive acknowledgement, a gesture that said, without any words, that the house was not complete without her. Mabel held the key firmly, as if holding an entire history, tucked it into her apron pocket, and simply said, "The soul of the house isn't kept in a key, but in a gesture like this." Nicholas smiled. It was the kind of response only she could give. That same day, while organizing a small gathering with the staff, Nicholas realized how much everything had changed. Previously, such gatherings were planned out of obligation, almost like a social protocol. Now, it was a genuine moment of celebration among people who respected each other, who shared memories, who formed a true community within those walls. Laughter echoed through the corridors. The smell of food filled the house, and even the younger ones, who had never known the old dynamics, seemed to sense that there was something special there. Mabel moved among the guests with the lightness of someone who knew everything was in its right place. And Nicholas, watching from afar, was convinced he had found the right path back. It wasn't just about having Mabel in the house again. It was about having her at the heart of the story, where she always belonged. And that, more than any structural change, was what truly saved that home. Over the following months, That reconciliation grew increasingly solid, not only between Nicholas and Mabel, but also among everyone who inhabited and moved through the house. The new staff began listening to the old stories Mabel told during breaks, learning about every detail of the house that no manual could teach. It was as if Mabel were transmitting a silent knowledge, a living legacy that transcended mere tasks. Nicholas observed this with admiration and often just watched, without interfering, simply absorbing. He knew that this kind of wisdom wasn't imposed, it was shared, and he knew too that he was now part of the right cycle, one of listening before acting, of recognizing before demanding, of valuing before losing. One day, while organizing old photo albums to restore some family records, Mabel found an image forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. It was of a young Nicholas sitting on the stairs with disheveled hair and a bitten cookie in hand. And beside him, Mabel, smiling with a dish towel draped over her shoulder and a protective gaze fixed on the boy. They spent a few minutes silently looking at that image. "Funny, I didn't even remember this photo," said Nicholas, almost moved. Mabel smiled softly. "There are things we live so naturally that we don't even realize their importance, but time takes care of showing it." Those words lingered in the air. Like so many others, she had spoken with simplicity and immense weight. Nicholas took that photo and placed it in a small picture frame that had been empty on the living room shelf. It wasn't a grand gesture, but in a way, it was a symbol. A way of saying, now everything is back in its rightful place, including memory. Over time, Mabel became something even greater within the house, not just a reference of care and organization, but an emotional link between the past, present, and future. It was common to see young employees sitting with her during breaks, listening to advice about life, old stories of the Deo family, or learning kitchen tips that she taught with patience and humor. Nicholas, for his part, came to understand that leadership wasn't about imposing, but about inspiring. That respect didn't come from a position, but from character, what Mabel had always practiced without. Raising her voice, he now tried to emulate in his own way, with humility, presence, and intention. The house, once marked by tension and appearances, now vibrated in harmony. And more than that, there was a feeling that spread through every corner, belonging. Then, on an ordinary morning, Nicholas decided to do something he had long desired. He had a discreet, simple plaque made in aged bronze and fixed it at the entrance of the library. The text was short: Mabel's space, dedicated to the silent wisdom that builds homes and transforms lives. When Mabel saw it, she stood in front of the plaque for several minutes, silently. Then she turned to him with eyes slightly filled with tears, yet with the same firm expression as always. "This wasn't necessary," she said, almost in a whisper. "I know," replied Nicholas, "but it was only fair." And in that moment, they both understood that this recognition wasn't just a gesture of gratitude. It was a milestone of everything that had been rebuilt, not only in the house, but in their relationship. And above all, it was proof that even as time passes, there are stories that persist, that transform, and that leave marks no luxury or modernity can ever erase. In the following months, Mabel's space began to host more than just books and cultural activities. It became a meeting point, a silent symbol that there existed something deeper than beautiful walls and antique furniture. There was history, memory, and respect. Children went there to listen to storytelling. Young people sought life advice, and even occasional visitors were moved by the welcoming atmosphere emanating from that special corner of the house. Nicholas would spend a few minutes there every day, even if only to read a page, adjust a book on the shelf, or chat with someone. It was his way of keeping alive the essence of what had been rebuilt, and every time he passed through that door, he remembered the journey that had brought him there. A journey of mistakes, yes, but above all, of learning and transformation. Mabel, for her part, never boasted about anything. She continued doing what she always did, in her own time, in her own way. But those who observed her knew there was now a different peace in her, a calm certainty that her story had not been erased nor ignored, but recognized. And that recognition didn't come from titles or empty honors, but from something much more valuable: actions. Nicholas and she, though in very different roles, now walked side by side like two pillars of the same structure. They weren't just employer and housekeeper. They were, in their own way, responsible for keeping the soul of that house alive. And even though life still brought challenges, both knew that nothing would ever be the same again, because now there was dialogue where there had once been silence, presence where there had been omission, and above all, respect where neglect had once been permitted. And that, in the end, was what made everything worthwhile. One night, as winter approached, Nicholas walked alone through the corridors of the house, as he often did before sleeping. The low lights softly illuminated the old portraits, the carefully preserved furniture, the rugs that told silent stories. He stopped in front of the main corridor mirror, the same mirror where, as a boy, he used to gaze at his reflection with curiosity. Now, seeing himself there, he saw a different man, not just because of more visible wrinkles or slightly grayer hair, but because of the way he held his gaze. For the first time in a long while, he could look at himself without discomfort. Not because he had erased the mistakes of the past, but because he had faced each one. And above all, because he had learned from them. The mirror no longer reflected an heir trying to meet others' expectations, but someone who had rebuilt his roots with consciousness and truth. The next morning, as always, Mabel arrived early. She carried a small basket with freshly baked cakes and an embroidered cloth covering the top, a traditional, almost ritual gesture. Seeing her enter the kitchen, Nicholas smiled. It was natural to see her there again, but still, that moment always carried something special. They sat down for coffee, as they had so many times before, and between sips, between conversations about the house, the flowers, and the small details of the day, there was a comfortable silence that only those who share history understand. The house is well, she said, looking around. It's alive, Nicholas nodded. Because you are here, he replied. Mabel didn't retort or smile. She simply looked at him with serenity, as if knowing that deep down, some truths need not be repeated. They show themselves day after day in the gestures of those who remain. Time went on, as it always does. But inside that house, time now seemed gentler. The seasons changed, the days passed, yet there was a sense of balance that had once been unknown there. The Deo family mansion was no longer just a symbol of tradition and power. It had become a space of truth, rebuilt by humble hands, sincere words, and silences filled with presence. Nicholas continued learning, making mistakes and getting things right, but now with the awareness of someone who carries responsibility not only for what he builds, but for those he cares for. And Mabel, with her silent wisdom, remained the steadfast center of that story, not by imposition, but by essence. Years later, when someone asked Nicholas how he managed to transform his life and his house so deeply, he always replied the same way, without preamble. It was when Mabel left that I understood everything, and it was when she returned that everything made sense. It was simple but true, because deep down, that whole story wasn't about scandals, luxuries, or exaggerated dramas. It was about people, about listening, respect, and presence, about recognizing those who stayed by your side even when the world was distracted by the shine of appearances, and about finally understanding that a home isn't built with imposing walls. It's built with real bonds. The house remained, yes, but what truly endured was that which isn't measured by tapestries or porcelain. The living memory of a woman who, without needing titles, taught everyone what belonging is. And even today, when the wind blows through the corridors or the aroma of coffee invades the kitchen, it seems as if the house, in silence, gives thanks. If you felt the weight of this story and believe that stories like this deserve to be told, Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and share with someone special. Let's spread more narratives with truth, feeling, and humanity.